Good morning to all of you, my Calvary Baptist Church family and friends. I pray that you and your families are continuing to remain safe and are taking all precautions as this nation continues to endure the COVID-19 pandemic. As stated on last Sunday, if there is anything that Calvary can do to assist you and your family during this trying time, please do not hesitate to contact your family deacon or myself, and we'll see to it that you receive any and all resources within the church's ability. This is, in fact, the second week in which you and I have not been able to fellowship and worship collectively on the campus of Calvary. And as your pastor and under shepherd, I want each of you to know that I miss and love you all dearly. For to know Calvary is to know love. I cannot wait for you and I to reunite on those sacred grounds located on 130 Walnut Street. But until then, I'm clinging to the words of the psalmist in Psalm 27, verse 1 through 5. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked advance against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. For in the day of trouble, for in the day of COVID-19, he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his sacred tent and set me high upon a rock. Just before we get into our word on this morning, just want you to know that we do have 4 giving options. We do have Cash App, and that is money sign CBC Chester. We do have PayPal, which is also CBC Chester. We do have Giveify, and that is Calvary Baptist Church, Chester, South Carolina. And we do have curbside giving that will be taking place at the church this morning from 11 o'clock to 11:30 a.m. I'm also asking that if you have any prayer requests at this time, you can feel free to inbox those prayer requests on our Facebook page, Calvary Baptist Church / Chester, South Carolina, and we'll be sure to pray with you and to pray for you. I hope that your spirits are still on fire for the Lord. And from our message on last Sunday, I still encourage you, whatever you do, don't stop worshiping. As many of you already know, that the month of March is Women's History Month. This month has been dedicated and set aside to reflect on the often overlooked contributions of women throughout the United States. The very reality is that as we look throughout the Old and New Testament, quite often it seems as if women are overlooked. When you and I look at the story of Job, everything is told from Job's perspective. Not one time do we hear things from his wife's perspective. We see Job suffering, but we do not get the opportunity to look at how his wife must be suffering. After all, she's had to wrestle with saying goodbye, not to one child, but to all of her children. In fact, we know Job's name. We know his children's name. We know his friend's name, but we do not know his wife's name. It seemed as if this woman was overlooked. The woman with the issue of blood, who had a made-up mind that if she just pressed her way to Jesus, if she just touched the hem of his garment, she would be made whole. We know all about her condition. We know that she's been to doctor after doctor. We know that she spent all of her money. We know that instead of getting better, things have gotten worse. We know all about this woman. However, we do not know her name. We know that one day Jairus went to Jesus and asked Jesus, Lord, if you just touch my little daughter who is very sick, she may be well and live. We know all about Jairus being an official at a local synagogue. And as the narrative plays out, not one time do we hear of Jairus' wife's name or even Jairus' daughter's name. We know their story, but we don't know their name. We know about the Samaritan woman whom Jesus met at Jacob's well. We see the dialogue between Jesus and this woman. We see the end result of this woman being so full of her encounter with the Lord that she left the very thing that she went to feel. She left her water jar and went back to the town saying to everyone, come see a man who knows all about me. We know her story. but we don't know her name. We know about Peter's mother-in-law who was sick with a fever. We know that the family had asked Jesus to do something to help her. We know that Jesus stood close to this woman and ordered the sickness to go away. We know about this woman who was healed. However, we do not know her name. We know that one day, while Jesus was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, there was a woman in the crowd who was bent over for 18 years. We know that Jesus called her up in front of everybody. We know that Jesus put his hands on her and immediately she was able to straighten up. We know that this woman began to praise God. We know that those synagogue leaders began to get upset, asking Jesus, why did he heal on the Sabbath? We know all about this woman's encounter and healing, but we do not know her name. We know about this little woman at name who was on her way to bury her one and only son. We know that she has a large crowd with her. We know that she's on her way to the cemetery. And however, before she gets to the cemetery, she encounters Jesus and his crowd. We know that Jesus tells this woman not to cry. We know that Jesus' heart went out to her. We know all about Jesus touching this dead boy and giving him back to his mother. However, we do not know this woman's name. I've just listed a few for our hearing on this morning. But there are countless of other women in the Bible whose names are not mentioned, who do not get the credit they deserve, who seem to be in the background, just extras in the story. They seldomly have the spotlight. Brothers and sisters, it was James Brown in 1968 who said, this is a man's world, but it wouldn't be nothing without a woman or girl. Like many of you, due to social distancing, I've had time to catch up on some cleaning, personal reading. I've even had the opportunity to Netflix and chill with myself. During my Netflix and chill time, I was able to watch Self-Made, a limited series that depicted the inspired life of Madam C.J. Walker. This is a series that I encourage all of you, if you hadn't already, to watch with your family and friends. And as you watch this movie, allow it to push you to strive to accomplish your dreams, despite rough beginnings, despite bumps in the road, and despite hearing your haters and naysayers. Allow this movie to motivate you to pick up those dreams, goals, and aspirations you may have given up on or tossed to the side. Allow this movie to give you the strength and the courage to go back, to pick up those dreams and keep on dreaming until you reach what God has in store for you. Like many of you, when I look at a movie that is based on a true story, I always go back and do my research to see what may have been fictional or what may have been left out in the movie. For those of you who've already watched the movie, we saw when Madam C.J. Walker had a rival by the name of Addie Monroe. It seems like Monroe was always out to sabotage Miss Madam C.J. Walker. However, upon my research, I learned that there was no one in Madam C.J. Walker's life by the name of Addie Monroe. However, there was a woman by the name of Annie Malone. Like Miss Walker, Annie was born to formerly enslaved parents. She was orphaned at an early age and was later raised by her older sisters. In 1900, at the age of 31, Miss Malone would move to Lovejoy, Illinois. And as she moved there, she would begin mixing and experimenting with different ingredients. And she soon discovered her signature product, the wonderful hair grower. Miss Malone, just a few years later, would go on to hire Miss Walker as a sales agent. And after Miss Walker would marry CJ, she later struck out to do her own thing. And these two seem to have had some kind of falling out. However, it is not very clear about what that falling out was in regards to. Miss Annie Malone, Wonder Hair Grower, was only one of her products, which would fall under her business called the Pearl Company. She started with door-to-door sales. However, she would expand to retail. And finally, she created her first Pearl College in 1918. Her landmark building housed not only a cosmetology school that trained her recruits, but there was also her main office that dealt with nationwide businesses. and a manufacturing center for her parole products. Over the lifespan of her company, she had 32 parole colleges and tens of thousands of people who served as her parole agents. It is believed that throughout Monroe's career, she was at one point in time worth $14 million. I know that this movie on Netflix depicted the life of Madam C.J. Walker, but from looking at this movie, I would have never known about Annie Monroe. If I had not done my own research, I would have never heard about the story of this phenomenal woman. As we've seen throughout the Bible and just now, quite too often, women do not receive the recognition that they deserve, and oftentimes their hard work and contributions to society are overlooked. On today, for just a few moments, I want you and I to look at two courageous women. Quite often, we do not hear their story or celebrate them. But as this Women's History Month comes to a close, I would be remiss if I didn't share their story with you. So I'm asking for a short period of time as we worship during this virtual worship experience. I ask that you would journey with me to the book of Exodus, the first chapter. And it's there for our hearing that I want to lift up verses 15 through 21. Again, that is the book of Exodus, the first chapter, lifting up verses 15 through 21. And I'll be reading from the English Standard Version, and you'll find these words. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be unto God. For this short sermonic discourse, I want to talk to you from the thought, thank God for the midwives. I would have you to note that by the end of the Genesis narrative, we see where the Israelites had achieved much favored immigrant status in the land of Egypt. The reason these Egyptians had welcomed these Hebrew foreigners from Canaan so well was because they were family and relatives of Joseph. Many of you know Joseph, the one who was favored by his father. In fact, his father loved him more because Joseph was born to him in old age. Joseph, the one whose father had a robe made of many colors for him. Joseph, the one who had a dream, and upon telling it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Joseph, the one whose brothers had conspired to kill him. Joseph, the one who would in fact be sold by his brothers to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver and would be transported to Egypt. I'm talking about Joseph. Joseph, the one who was overseer of Potiphar's house and was put in charge of all that Potiphar had. Joseph, the one whose Potiphar's wife tried to do and later lied on Joseph, resulting in Joseph being put in jail due to false accusations. Joseph, the one who, although was in prison, was in fact put in charge of the prisoners. Joseph, the one who would interpret the cupbearer and the chief baker's dream. Joseph, the one who would interpret Pharaoh's dream during his time, thus resulting in being put over all the land of Egypt and being put in second in command next to Pharaoh. Joseph, the one who told his brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And I'm so glad that I serve a God who's always on the side of the oppressed. And despite being marginalized, God always seems to flip that thing around. And I believe there's someone who can testify that you had folk who walked out of your life. You had folk who called you everything but a child of God. You had folk who tried to do their best to undermine you. You had folks who tried to put stumbling blocks in your way. But before you could cuss them out, before you could be petty and get even, somehow and some way the Lord just prepared a table before you in the presence of your enemies. The reason why the Israelites are in the land of Egypt is because upon Pharaoh, in whom Joseph was second in command to, meeting Joseph's father and brothers during the famine, he had given them permission to settle in the land. Of course, upon them settling in the land, they eventually began to multiply in number. Years had passed, and Joseph had now went on to glory. And in the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, verse number 8, we're informed that there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And instead of him looking at the Israelites as welcome guests, they were looked at as being feared aliens. And doesn't that sound like 46 minus 1? Who doesn't carry himself as a president, but rather he carries himself as a king. This king does not see immigrant children as being precious gifts from God, but rather he looks at them as being prisoners. That's why he had no problem with keeping these children locked away from their parents at the border like they've committed a crime. These poor children were slept on aluminum blankets. Sounds like Pharaoh to me. This king, located on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., told 3 black Democratic congressmen to go back where they came from. But he failed to realize that the woman he sleeps with that night is not from here. Sounds like Pharaoh to me. In an immigration, this king asked a question in reference to Haiti and African countries. Why are we having all these people from S-hole countries come here? Sounds like Pharaoh to me. This new king in Exodus did not look at this minority group as welcome guests and friends, but rather he looked at them as being the enemy. Pharaoh looked at the Israelites as being too many and too mighty. And he feared that if war ever broke out between the Israelites, they might side with their enemies and fight against them. Therefore, he began to enslave the Israelites. He set them out to be his taskmakers. He inflicted them with heavy burdens, and they built Pharaoh's store cities without ever receiving a dime. It sounds like the very thing our ancestors did when they built the king's house, better known as the White House. But the Bible declares that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread about. It is interesting to know that our people were oppressed by slavery, but still yet they multiplied. Our people were oppressed by Jim Crow and segregation, but still yet we multiplied. Our people were oppressed by being drafted into the war, but still yet they multiplied. Our people were oppressed by mass incarceration, but still yet we're multiplying. Our people were oppressed by voter suppression, but still yet we're multiplying. God is always on the side of the oppressed, because these Israelites kept on multiplying in number. The king of Egypt instructed the Hebrew midwives, when you serve as midwives to Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. It is here where we see Pharaoh trying to do everything possible to stop the Israelites, boys and men, from increasing in number. The Bible goes on to inform you and I that the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but rather they let the male children live. And baby, when you fear God, there are some things you just can't do. When you fear God, there are just some places you can't go. When you fear God, there are some things you just can't say. When you fear God, you can't just go along to get along. No, when you fear God, you have to stand up for the least of these. When you fear God, going to church is only a small fraction. But when you really fear God, you have to look out for the disenfranchised, the oppressed, and the afflicted. Might I remind you? Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did to the least of these my brethren, you did unto me. Long before there was a Montgomery bus boycott, long before there was a march on Washington, long before there were any sit-ins, there stood these two midwives who would display the first act of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance for the sake of justice in the Bible. You see, these midwives failed to obey Pharaoh's deathly command because they knew as a midwife, their responsibility was to protect and to preserve life. They knew that their responsibility was to help give new life and not to take any life. They knew that their responsibility was to help these women, not to hinder these women. They knew that their responsibility was to comfort these mothers and not to cause any grief. And my brothers and sisters, if it had not been for these two midwives, perhaps there would not be a Moses or an Exodus. If it had not been for these two women, perhaps the entire biblical narrative would have changed dramatically. Lord, I thank you for these midwives. These midwives had the responsibility of bringing new life. And despite your gender, the Lord is calling everyone in Calvary and everyone listening to be a midwife. We ought not ever get so saved and sanctified that we forget where it is that the Lord has brought us from. We've sat with our hands folded long enough. God is calling you and I to help birth new life. We have to help bring life to someone who does not know Christ. So will you help me? Will you join with me in being a midwife? You see, whenever you encourage and speak life to that person on your job, you're acting as a midwife. Whenever you bring that lost child or friend to church, you're acting as a midwife. Whenever you get off your high horse and stoop down to help that homeless person who is in serious need, you're acting as a midwife. Whenever you feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick, visit those in prison, you're acting as a midwife. Whenever you mentor that child, you're acting as a midwife. We may not be in the same delivery room, but I charge each and every one of us to be a midwife, to stand up for those who've been written off, who have nowhere to go. The reason these two women were able to stand up for justice and for the least of these is because they feared the Lord. And if you look back over your life, the only reason why you're still standing after people wrote you off, the only reason why you're still standing after people said you would never amount to anything, is because there stood a midwife. There stood a strong woman who feared the Lord. Big Mama feared the Lord. That church mother feared the Lord. That kindergarten teacher you had feared the Lord. That coach, that Girl Scout leader, that older woman in the neighborhood, she feared the Lord. If it hadn't been for those midwives who saved you, who encouraged you, who talked some sense into you, who spoke life into you, if it hadn't been for that midwife who got you out of trouble, who took you out of that rough environment, if they didn't drag you to church, where would you be on today? If that midwife made a difference in your life, why wouldn't you want to turn around and to help bring new life to someone else? The Bible informs us that God dealt with the midwives and the people, multiplied and grew very strong, and he even gave the midwives families of their own. Beloved, when you look out for the oppressed, and when you look out for the least of these and the marginalized, God will in fact reward you for your faithfulness. The only way we're going to grow in number is to help give new life, to tell someone about a man who over 2,000 years ago on the cross bled, died for our sins, that we may have life and have it more abundantly. As previously stated, many times our women do not receive the credit that they deserve. So today, we ought to thank God for the midwives. You see, the civil rights movement would not have been all that it was if it hadn't been for the midwives. The church would not be all that the church is today if it hadn't been for the midwives. NASA would not be all that NASA is today if it had not been for the midwives. Black Lives Matter would not be in existence if it had not been for the midwives. You yourself would not be where you are today if it had not been for the midwives. So on today, as you reflect on your life, think about those midwives. Think about those women who made a difference in your life. And if they're still living, I dare you to send them a text, send them a letter, send them a card, call them, tell them thank you for the difference that they've made in your life. If that midwife, if that strong woman has transitioned and is no longer here, on today, pause and reflect on the difference they made in your life. Lord, we thank you for the midwives. For too often, our women's work have gone unnoticed. Their stories seem to have disappeared from history. But on today, look at your own life and reflect on those mighty strong midwives who made a difference in your life. And I promise you, if you look back, you can testify that there was a big mama. There was a midwife who helped groom, polish you into the person you are today. So Lord, I thank you for the midwives. My brothers and sisters, it is my prayer that God will continue to smile and he will continue to bless you. Be safe, be encouraged, and most importantly, thank God for the midwives.